A 2-day search for the country's next National Director of Public Prosecutions has now wrapped up, and the 6 shortlisted candidates completing their interviews those candidates completing their interviews before the advisory panel. So the process is now going into its final stages. Government has to weigh up who will take up the leadership of the National Prosecuting Authority and steer the institution through its toughest integrity and performance challenges. CASAC Executive Director Lawson Naidoo has been keeping an eye on all of these interviews over the last few days and joins us this morning. Lawson, good morning. Thanks for your time. I know it's not your first rodeo for the day, but thank you very much for being with us. Wow, I mean, the last 2 days, really, really interesting. For people who didn't know the candidates, certainly got a better view of them. Maybe let's just start with how well you thought the advisory panel did and all of those involved in conducting, the questioning and the interviewing. How well did you think they did? Do you think they asked the right questions?
Good morning again. That's a very good question to start with, because I think there have been concerns expressed about the composition of the panel, the lack of legal and prosecutorial knowledge amongst panel members. And I think this came through in the questioning over the last 2 days. Some of the panel members seem to be taken in by some of the detail of looking at specific cases and specific decisions that were taken. Now, whilst these might be important in reflecting on the candidate's suitability for the office, I think they missed out a lot of the time on the bigger strategic vision that I certainly would have been looking for from each of the candidates. Now, these issues were covered, but not in the kind of detail that I think it was necessary, and perhaps not as robustly as it ought to have been done. So I think there are lessons there for the future in terms of the composition of the panel, having people on that panel who really do understand the workings of the NPA.
Oh, give me some examples then of that critique, Lawson.
Well, I think it's just not really understanding the structure of the NPA, the appointment powers of the president in terms of the senior leadership of the NPA, not just at the level of the NDPP, but the deputy national directors as well as the directors of public prosecutions in each of the provinces. All of these are executive appointments. So the NDPP has little control in terms of hiring and firing the senior management. Power is devolved to the DPPs to take prosecutorial decisions, and the instances where the NDPP can intervene are limited in terms of only if the prosecution policy and guidelines have not been adhered to. So those are some of the constraints. Secondly, the issues around the fact that the NPA reports to Parliament through the Department of Justice. To that extent, it is financially and operationally not an independent institution. And this is a constraint on the ability of the NPA to execute its constitutional mandate.
I wonder how you'll answer the next question, because given, some of the controversies and criticisms about the 6 individuals whose names are in the hat, there are already some issues that you can cite with regard to each of them. But you have made those observations closely. And who so far do you think, out of the pool that we do have, has emerged as a serious contender, not only and simply in terms of experience, but in terms of the potential for independence and for courage?
Yeah. Again, that comes back to the issue around the panel itself, because the criteria by which the panel are evaluating these candidates has not been made public, apart from what is, was set out in the advert for the position, which introduced for the first time a requirement that candidates must have 10 years of executive management experience. But beyond those broad categories, we don't really know the criteria. So, there were, as you say, controversies around some of the candidates, specifically Mr. Menzi Simelane and Advocate Andrea Johnson from the IDAC. I think yesterday's interview, a very lengthy interview of Mr. Simelane, really proved that he had no place to be interviewed, because the panel ultimately questioned his integrity. So one has to ask, how did he make it through the first phase to be deemed fit and proper when the panel were clearly so concerned about issues around his honesty and integrity, issues that were in the public domain even before civil society organizations such as CASAC raised those concerns directly with the panel.
Yeah.
Having said that, I think the two, sorry, Iman, the two candidates that probably emerge as front runners at this point in time would be Xolisile Khanyile and Hermione Cronje. I think those were the two candidates that seem to have impressed the panel the most, and I think objectively stood out above the others.
Okay.
They bring very different skill sets.
Yeah, let me go in very quickly on Hermione, because you mentioned Menzi Simelane, and I don't want to lose that thread of thinking. Hermione Cronje giving that blistering account of dysfunction inside the NPA. She said she had resigned twice because the institution was a, quote, fight and it lacked the capacity to deliver. What does that testimony tell us about the real state of the NPA? And do you think that appointing her would be a potentially stabilizing move?
Well, I think the first thing on that is that those of us who watch the NPA closely know of these challenges. She referred to them as crises or catastrophes. I think that may be an exaggeration. I think she admitted herself that she is prone to exaggeration. That there are deep-seated fundamental institutional problems at the NPA is clear for anyone to see. And again, I think this comes to the issue around the capacity of the panel itself. They seem to be surprised by some of the things that Hermione Cronje said. But these are issues in the public domain. There is a skills gap at the NPA. They lost a large number of prosecutors during the state capture era. Whilst they have been recruiting again and have had additional resources, it takes a long time for them to upskill those people to be able to prosecute complex crimes. And the ability of the NPA to bring in external legal assistance has been, very, very slow. So these are some of the concerns that Hermione Cronje raised, but they're not new. And the question is, how are you going to go about fixing that? And in fact, it was quite instructive that towards the end of her interview, the Minister of Justice said, well, if the legislative framework doesn't change and you don't have the powers to do all of these things that you say need to be done, will you be frustrated? And, I think that those are the kinds of issues that should be probed with each of the candidates, because that's a fundamental issue that is facing the NPA at this point in time.
I mean, I notice that you don't talk about Andrea Johnson or Adrian Mop either. They were grilled about major failed prosecutions. I mean, on that repertoire is Estina, it is the Cocoa matter, declining conviction rates. But should these types of performance failures automatically disqualify candidates, or are they just symptomatic? And I'm just thinking about Andrea Johnson's testimony when I'm thinking about this, when she was quizzed about conviction rates and the performance of prosecutors in the Western Cape. Issues that alluded to institutional collapse, that if we're being fair, an individual, shouldn't be saddled with accountability around. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree with that, Imam. I think, the reality is the NPA loses cases. You go to court, there's no guarantee that you're going to get a conviction, in a successful prosecution. But the issue is around how well prepared were the prosecutors for that. And these are institutional issues that speak to capacity, resourcing, the number of cases that individual prosecutors are handling simultaneously, and so on. So, those are valid questions to be raised, but I don't think people should be disqualified from consideration purely on the basis of those issues. One has to look at a broader holistic picture. And the reason I didn't mention, Andrea Johnson, Adrian Mop, and Nicolette Bell is that, in my view, they didn't kind of demonstrate the kind of leadership skills and gravitas, for want of a better word, to be able to take on what is really a very, very big job in a very, very complex environment. So, for those reasons, I think that and certainly my perception was that the panel were not overly impressed with them.
Yeah, I mean, so I should have mentioned it was Nicolette Bell in relation to the Western Cape. I know I said Andrea Johnson. She's, of course, the head of IDAC. Well, so Parliament recently rejected proposals to reform the NDPP's appointment process. So the president now has this sole appointment power. How much does it undercut the credibility of the current recruitment exercise, do you think?
Well, in terms of the Constitution, the NDPP is appointed by the President, acting in his capacity as the head of the National Executive, i.e. of Cabinet. This has been the practice since 1998. It's only in 2018 and again now that President Ramaphosa put in place a panel to advise him and to provide him with a short list of candidates to consider from which he will appoint. So this is something that many of us have been arguing for a long time, that this should be formalized, because there's no guarantee that a future president will follow this practice. But there needs to be broader public consultation around as the issue I raised earlier, around the composition of the panel to ensure that there is the requisite knowledge and understanding of the NPA on that very panel, so that they're clear in terms of what they are seeking, what they're looking for, the kinds of qualities in the candidate, and understanding the challenges that the NPA faces.
For better or for worse, depending on whom you're asking, I guess there's relief in the country that we actually have an NDPP that is fulfilling their term. It's been a poison chalice, is the term being used. There have been political influence and all sorts of issues that have swirled around the person that occupies that seat. But beyond all of that, we have a real problem in South Africa in 2025 around whistleblower assassinations. We've got crippling skills shortages. There are failed corruption prosecutions. We've named just a few of those. Also, the issue of internal factionalism. This goes back historically as well in the NPA and what's been highlighted over the last 48 hours as well. From your perspective, what must this NDPP, the new person coming in, hopefully with a new broom, a new attitude, as some have promised, a new vision, what should their priorities be in their first 100 days?
Well, I think, to take stock of where the NPA is at the moment, to have a deep dive into identifying what the, continuing challenges are. Some of these were highlighted as we discussed in the course of the interviews. But also, critically, the Constitution says that the Minister of Justice has final responsibility over the NPA. And the incoming NDPP, if it were me, the first thing I would do is go and sit down with the Minister of Justice and the President and say, I need greater powers in order to deliver on the mandate that the Constitution requires of this office. And, the Minister and the President have committed to enhancing the independence of the NPA. And that's something that I think needs to be done urgently. And then for the National Director to put forward a strategic plan of how they will utilize those powers in order not just to stabilize, but to enhance the capacity of the NPA. How cases in the magistrates and regional courts going to be handled differently, how they're going to be processed more speedily. And then, importantly, from a public perspective, is how are cases emanating from the Zondo Commission going to be dealt with more speedily. We're going to have a number of other cases that will now emerge from the Langa Commission and so on. So these are huge challenges. But again, I think this needs to be a conversation about the law enforcement system as a whole, not just the NPA, because what we're seeing from the Langa Commission, for example, is the dysfunction in the investigative agencies, including SAPS and crime intelligence and the like.
Yeah.
And the NPA, does not operate in a vacuum. It relies on those other institutions to be able to do its job.
I wanted to ask you, just in closing and very quickly, we're out of time, Lawson, is around what's happening at the Inkabinda inquiry with the current NDPP and whether she's acquitting herself well in giving an account as to why, the Gauteng DPP, Andrew Chauke, was someone who was deemed to not have been fit for office. His lawyers come out swinging. This is Tembeka Nxukaitobi.
Yeah, well, I haven't been following that as closely because of other things, but the perception one has is that the case against Andrew Chauke was not well considered and well structured. The NPA now seeking to have the terms of reference amended to include other issues, and these are things that should have been done a long time ago. And I think there needs to be some accountability of why that didn't happen, given that this inquiry into Chauke's fitness has been so long in the making.
Lawson Naidoo, appreciate your time.